Welcome back to coverage of Magnus Carlsen's journey through the 2022 Tata Steel Tournament. Today he takes on Polish Grandmaster Jan Krzysztof Duda. As with most head-to-heads, Carlsen has the psychological upper hand coming into today's match, having won 3 out of their games against each other and only lost 1. Okay, let's get right to it. Duda opens with e4, maybe e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. The Ruy Lopez or Spanish game, a6, the Morphy defense, and Duda backs his bishop up. I'll just briefly mention why Duda can't simply take on c6 and then take the e-pawn. We would have bishop takes c6, pawn takes, knight takes on e4, and then queen to d4. That's the key move. Now both the knight and pawn are attacked, so Carlsen would win back his material, but not only that. For example, knight back to f3, queen takes on e4, and the only move here, or the only reasonable move here, is queen e2 to block. And then the queens get exchanged, and black is better here, mostly because of the bishop pair. But of course, Duda knows all this and doesn't take on c6. He backs his bishop up. We have knight f6. Duda castles, bishop e7, and rook e1. Now at this point, Duda actually could take on c6 and then take the pawn on e5. So Carlsen prevents that with b5. Bishop backs up, and Carlsen castles. And here we have a4. Carlsen has played this position a couple dozen times before, so we're still very much in familiar territory. And there are 3 reasonable options here. There's bishop b7, there's pawn to b4, and there's the one that Carlsen plays, rook to b8. And in fact, this line is so common that even Duda and Carlsen have had this exact position facing each other before in the 2021 Sochi World Cup. Back then, Duda played c3 and the game ended up in a draw. But here, a takes. And so here, white has control of the open a file, but black will be looking to push his b pawn, maybe open it up, exchange it for a c pawn at some point, and activate his rook along the b file. So h6 by Duda, a useful prophylactic move, both clearing the back rank and protecting g4, expecting Carlsen to want to put a piece there at some point. We have d6, supporting the center. And we have c3, looking to support that d4 push. The drawback being that now you've created a target for the b pawn, and black is allowed to activate his rook. So we have b4. d3 by Duda, and now b takes c3, b takes c3. Carlsen's rook is now active. Duda's queen for the moment tied to the defense of the bishop, and h6 by Carlsen. Both sides seem to have a slow and methodical game plan with these quiet moves like h6 and h3. Bishop e3 centralizes and develops. Rook e8, expecting the e file to open in the future. Knight to d2 and bishop f8. Bishop f8 is typical in these openings, both protecting the kingside pawns and getting out of the way of the rook. Queen c2 finishes development. Bishop e6 looking to exchange light-squared bishops because white's light-squared bishop is just more active and eyes the often weak f7 square. So we see an exchange and rook captures. At the moment, we have a symmetrical position, both in terms of pawn structure and in terms of pieces. But that's about to change. Duda finally feels ready to break in the center now with d4. So Carlsen captures. Knight takes, and knight takes. And finally, pawn takes. And now the imbalance is in the pawn structure. And this imbalance favors Duda, white, for 2 reasons. For one, white has a strong center with the e and d pawn, but perhaps more importantly, Carlsen's c pawn is weak and backward. Queen e8 looks to add pressure on the e pawn. Carlsen would happily exchange pawns, allowing Duda to take on c7 and himself winning Duda's strong e-pawn. But d5 by Duda, and Carlsen backs up. Rook a4 now provides lateral defense to the e-pawn. Now, of course, Duda could play f3 and protect the pawn that way. So why doesn't he? Well, I think because moving pawns in front of your king when you don't absolutely have to tends to compromise future king safety. And yeah, Duda's king is safe right now, but neither player knows what the position will look like 10, 20 moves from now. Here, Carlsen actually has a chance to get rid of his weak c-pawn by playing c5. What could happen is en passant, rook c7, rook c1. Both players now trying to add as many defenders and attackers to the c-pawn as they can. So rook c8 and rook c4. So 3 attackers and defenders each. And, you know, Carlsen doesn't play this, but if he had, he could have gained back the c-pawn by d5 here. So this would pretty much force pawn takes, knight takes. And the point here is Carlsen would be able to win back the c-pawn by remaneuvering the knight either to e7 and then picking up the pawn, or via b4 and then picking up the pawn. And this would also come with a tempo on the queen on the b4 square. But back to the game. Instead, Carlsen makes use of a deflection tactic with rook to b2, forcing the exchange of rooks, as taking the rook removes the queen's defense of the a rook. So queen takes b2, queen takes a4, and Duda goes bishop to d4. And here it is just a monster bishop eyeing Carlsen's kingside, also with the battery with the queen behind it. And we talked about the pawn structure difference already, but one other salient difference here is how much better Duda's bishop is compared to Carlsen's. Carlsen's bishop playing a purely defensive role at the moment, locked in behind his own pawn chain here. That's a lot of arrows. Let's get rid of those. So the knight is attacked. Carlsen moves it. Rook a1, and the queen has to fall back. Queen c3 adds pressure along the c-file. Knight advances to f4, threatening the royal fork with a king and queen. So Duda can't have that. Protects with queen f3. Knight goes back. Rook c1, and a bit of shuffling with queen back to a4, attacking the undefended bishop on d4. Queen d3 protects it. And now a bit of a tactical move from Carlsen with f5, really hoping Duda will blunder and take the pawn. In fact, this is a bit of a test for you. Pause here and figure out why Duda shouldn't take the pawn on f5. And it's a little bit hard to see. I'll give you a hint. The answer is strategical in nature. There's no win of material. It's a strategic win for Carlsen if Duda takes the pawns. So pause it and figure it out. Okay, so if Duda takes the pawn, we could have knight f4 attacks the queen. Queen really only has one square to go that doesn't drop the bishop. So queen to c4, and the queens come off the board. Rook takes, and finally, knight takes d5. And material is equal here, but Carlsen has 2 connected passers with his pawn on c7 and d6. c7 used to be a weakness, now it's a strength. These 2 pawns will march up the board much quicker than Duda can mobilize his kingside majority. Duda has 4 pawns versus 2 of Carlsen's on the king side, but because there's more of them, which takes longer to move, and because they're not passed, they will be much slower making a queen. But we don't have that either. Instead, Duda plays g3 here, pawn takes, knight takes, and the queen shuffles back yet again to e8. The knight is attacked, so it moves back, and here the position liquidates. Rook takes, queen takes, king g2, and the queen falls back yet again to e8. Queen b5 here, looking to exchange queens. Of course, Carlsen can't do this, as that would blunder the c-pawn. like so. And there's now no way to protect the c-pawn. So instead, queen to c8, and Duda just goes back. The knight is attacked, so moves. Queen to e4. And now as a final test, what do you play here as Carlsen to equalize the position? All right, so remember what we talked about, what Carlsen's weakness was? His backward pawn on c7. So it's about getting rid of that. So c6, pawn takes, and queen takes. And now the queen trade is pretty much forced, as the queen is pinned to the king. The queens come off the board, and the bishop just falls back. And here, the tension is all gone, material is equal. In short, Carlsen is nominally worse because of his 2-pawn islands and isolated d-pawn, but it's too marginal of an advantage to expect anything. The position is dead drawn, and they both know it, so they agree to a draw here. In the lead after 3 rounds, Vidit Gujarati from India. Of course, it's still early days, not much separating the players as of yet. Grandelius from Sweden has, however, managed to separate himself from the pack in last place. This makes me sad, of course, as I am from Sweden. I was hoping he'd do well. At least Magnus is doing fairly well, which makes me happy as he's from Norway, and Norway is basically Sweden. Okay, I'm being told now that I'm running long, so I guess that's it for this one. See ya!